The SEC in particular is doing two things that I find pretty odious. One is trying to constantly expand their remit without telling people what the rules are, right? So, contrast this to, say, the OCC, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC. I disagree with them on some aspects on policy, but they're willing to clearly and publicly state what they think the rules are and what people are allowed to do. They put a note in the Federal Register laying out their views on blockchains pretty clearly for their banks.
This content is brought to you by Uphold, which makes crypto investing easy. I've been a user of Uphold since 2018, so I trust this platform and I can vouch for it. They have a full functional app, a full functional website, and they carry Bitcoin and all the top altcoins, including stablecoins. You can also trade precious metals on this platform, and as well as 37 fiat currencies. So Uphold is available in over 150 countries, and they are a safe platform. They have full reserve of customer assets. They don't commingle or lend your funds out, and they provide audits of their reserves. So it's a safe platform, and I trust it. I vouch for it, and I've interviewed the CEO, the CFO, and other representatives of the company. So if you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Austin Campbell, who's the founder and managing partner of Zero Knowledge Consulting. Austin, great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excited to be here.
Austin, as mentioned before the recording, I've wanted to speak to you for a long time. I've listened to your testimony before Congress. You're very knowledgeable about the crypto market and blockchain tech. So I've got a lot of questions for you, but let's kick it off with your background. Tell us about yourself, where you're from and where'd you grow up?
Yeah, so where am I from? Where did I grow up? The answer to that is the West Coast, despite the fact that I'm in New York right now. So I grew up in San Diego, California, which means everywhere else I live in the rest of the world, the weather is just strictly worse. So I have just accepted that as a part of my life. But I've lived all over the place. I've lived in multiple U.S. states across the West, the East, the Midwest, and traveled pretty extensively for work, especially throughout Asia. So, I've lived technically in New York longer than anywhere else in my life, but I'm old enough to have a lot of gray hair, and New York is only 14 years. So.
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned San Diego. My wife, she loves Santa Monica. It's funny. The grass is always greener. She wants to go to Santa Monica, leave the Northeast area.
Yeah, I would say, look, my honest view for people, New York is incomparable in terms of the people you meet and how much of a melting pot it is, but the weather here is hot garbage.
Yeah.
Like, had the Pilgrims landed on the West Coast, the East Coast would be uninhabited.
For sure. Tell us about your professional background. I saw you spend some time at Paxos, NYDIG, and so forth.
Yeah, so I started way back in the day in reinsurance. I was a math major as an undergraduate, and the kind of math I was studying was coincidentally useful in how you build models of terrorism risk, which became suddenly very timely in the early 2000s. So I worked on those, some pandemic modeling, and then hurricane, earthquake, natural catastrophe stuff, because that was a lot of where the money is in reinsurance. Left there, went to business school, NYU Stern, and out the back of that ended up at JPMorgan. So for about a decade, I was part of and then running insurance-linked trading at JPM and global rates. And what's important there is that includes a bunch of cash stability products, like, say, stable value, which is about almost $1 trillion market now. And so long before stable coins were a thing that I dealt with even more complicated cash stability products in the traditional financial space. And I think that's helped me have perspective on it that I, quite frankly, think some people in the space lack. After that, I was at Stoneridge, which, as you mentioned, is NYDIG's parent. So I helped out with some of the lending arrangements, cash management. That's really where I started getting into crypto deeply. I was at Citi, where I was the co-head of digital assets rates trading, along with Lee Smallwood. And then I was at Paxos, where I was the head of portfolio management and chief risk officer for one of our entities. Now I teach and I run my own consulting firm, largely focused on blockchain.
So tell us about your consulting firm. How are you advising companies? Is it with building their own tokens, adopting blockchain? Tell us about that.
It's really more the latter. So my specific focus is that I am pretty deeply sort of knowledgeable about financial markets plumbing, structure, and risk, thanks to the time I spent in that space. And a lot of those lessons are translatable to blockchain. And so when I was at Paxos and when I was at Stone Ridge, I really observed two things, which is one, there's very broken dialogue between the crypto space and the finance space. Both sides kind of disrespect the other and think the other side doesn't have anything useful to say about the world. And finance thinks that crypto is a fad that will go away. Crypto thinks they're going to destroy all banks and take over. Both of those things are false, right? And the reality is both sides have useful lessons for the other that they need to learn. So my ability to translate is very valuable. And then in terms of actually building specifically things using blockchain around real world assets or financial assets is where my expertise is. So stablecoins, tokenized assets, risk frameworks, how to think about building ecosystems, how to think about lending and borrowing, things like that. I'm not nearly cool enough to be like an NFT guy or something like that.
Well, thank goodness, because there's the NFT hype needs to die down a little bit, and we need real world utility application, whether it be insurance, deeds, whatever it is. But, something you just mentioned that, the Bitcoiners initially wanted to destroy the banks and the banks laughed at Bitcoin and crypto. But like you said, we need each other. So do you envision a future where it's a hybrid, the two coming together, CeFi plus DeFi?
Yeah, and I would say the way I think about it is more to zoom out and ask, how does financial market structure work in the first place? Like, what got me interested in crypto in general was not anything ideological. It's more thinking about some of the implications of a system that is transparent, always on, and can do atomic settlement, right? Because say it's 2008, right? And you're in markets and you're trading. One of the things that you're constantly asking yourself is, if I do a trade with somebody, are they going to still be solvent when we settle this thing, even a couple of days later? That's spot. Let's not even get to derivatives, just spot, right? And so if the entire financial world had been running on blockchain and doing 24/7 instantaneous settlement in 2008, things might have played out significantly differently. And so where I sort of come at the thing is more, I see blockchain as a way to bring what are probably some strict upgrades to the financial system. And so to me, it's less about is crypto right or is banking right, and more about, hey, how do we use this new technology in a way that is just system improving across many different types of applications?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're starting to see a bit of that with the adoption of stable coins. And like you said, having a 24/7 market, more transparency, more trust, eliminating the middleman, and whatever you say you have in your vault is there, right? You can verify it. I'm curious because I remember Jamie Dimon poo-pooing Bitcoin for years, going back to 2017. Were you at JPMorgan at that point? I remember speaking to folks who worked there and said, yeah, we can't touch this stuff. We'll get fired and all that. Were you around that time?
Yeah, so I was. And I think to some extent, a little bit of that is overblown. The reality is there just weren't good policies around it. So by the way, by way of background, if you work at an investment bank in a risk-taking position, there is a very deep compliance program about anything you are allowed to invest in, right? Yeah. So if I wanted to go buy a stock, like forget about Bitcoin, let's say I just want to buy Apple stock, I have to go pre-clear that with my compliance team and get permission to do that. You got to give them like the trade, the size, like what your current holdings are. And that's because people will have inside information, will be working on transactions, et cetera. So when people say like, I can't just buy Bitcoin, I'll get fired. Like, well, that's true of every asset when you're at one of these banks. So like context. With that said, like one of the things to understand about JPMorgan is that it is gigantic, right? This is a company that's had over 300,000 employees. But like JPMorgan as an entity is bigger than some small nations.
Oh yeah.
And so one of the things about Jamie is he's got all these different silos under him, and he's got lieutenants who sometimes disagree with him on things. And I would say what's made him a good CEO and what's caused him to last as long as he did is he's willing to empower people as long as they have very strong risk management. Because the same guy that allegedly publicly is crapping on Bitcoin is also pushing like Onyx and blockchain settlement in another part of the bank, and their wealth management team is looking at Bitcoin. And so I I would say Jamie speaks for Jamie. That may not be a pan-institutional view.
Yeah, I was about to just ask you a follow-up question on that. Were you involved in anything JPM Coin, Onyx, or Quorum and these things? Because, like you said, Jamie was making these statements, but yet JPMorgan was testing blockchain and building with it. Were you involved in any way?
So I was involved in some of the projects that I would describe as predecessors to that. Transparently, most of that happened after I left. I was in global markets where, some of our tech teams were spending all of our time thinking about things like settlement risk, like how do we do repo liquid at scale, cross-regional, cross-market derivatives margining, which is something we've never really launched a blockchain application for. So I was very conversant in the problems. We were looking at blockchain as one of many potential solutions to this, and that's kind of what Onyx came out of, with more of a payments focus there.
Got it. So tell us about your congressional testimony earlier this year.
Yeah, so I testified in front of a House Financial Services subcommittee on stablecoins specifically. So there's been a bill, it's alternately been called McHenry-Waters or just McHenry, going through focus specifically on a stablecoin framework for US dollar stablecoins in the United States. And so I was there as an expert testifying and essentially attempting to convey the message, in my opinion, that what we want in the United States is we want stablecoins onshore, where we can have transparency and visibility and to some extent control over them. We want them to be permitted on public blockchains because there are a lot of social benefits around those. And we want a regulatory framework with the right regulators and the right rules that make these things work properly. Because one of the things I said there that I say all the time is stablecoins aren't really new. Like, cash stability products are a thing that we understand from TradFi. I have seen basically nothing in crypto in that space that I don't know a French quant that's already blown up in like traditional finance. And so a lot of it is just understanding. The new part here is just putting it on a blockchain. Right. So a lot of the underlying stuff we already understand. I've said before, and I'll say for this podcast, I'm almost anti-financial innovation in stablecoins.
So on that note, we have a bunch of folks who are now innovating and building their own stablecoins. PayPal recently launched theirs. We talked about JPMorgan. Theirs is private, but they're nevertheless building a version. There's Tether, the world's largest stablecoin, followed by Circle's USDC. Do you anticipate other businesses and companies building their own stablecoins? And where does it stop, right? Especially if it's public. What type of ecosystem do you see in the future, especially with CBDCs also coming?
Yeah, so I think, look, a lot of the problem of people building their own stable coins has come into focus after interest rates moved up with the current structure that we have around stable coins. So in the United States, thanks largely to the efforts of our regulators that have been pointed in the wrong direction, it is basically impossible to build an interest-paying stablecoin that is not a security, which creates all sorts of problems. All right. And so what happens is every company, if they get to keep the interest off the reserve, wants to issue, unsurprisingly, their own stablecoin so that they can keep those profits. What this does is fragments the markets, creates a plethora of offerings that all work a little bit differently, and is very confusing for consumers. Probably also worse for regulators as they've got to deal with that. I would tell you, I don't see that in the long run being the future market state, because once there's an interest-bearing stablecoin that charges a fair fee, everybody can just use that, right? The liquidity will aggregate. It becomes fungible across everything, because the thought experiment I give people is imagine that Vanguard, right, which for those who don't know is the world's most boring asset manager. They charge very low fees. They do nothing interesting, and they're amazing. I've worked with them quite a bit. Good people. Imagine they issued a stable coin and all they did was buy T-bills, do overnight reverse repo like a stable coin should, charge like a 5 basis point fee, and just pay everything else through. Well, everybody's just going to use that and outsource it to Vanguard, right? So I think that's the end state once we get regulation right.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't envy the regulators. I know they have a hard job. I obviously wish the U.S. would move faster and they can get their things together. I know, like you said, that Patrick McHenry, we got 2 bills in the House. The one is the market structure, one is the stablecoin bill. And, I don't know what's going to be the future of all these different stable coins. But do you think the governments could potentially ban some of these private stablecoins because they're bringing their CBDCs? This is happening globally, and there's talks of the digital dollar. I know this is a hard question because we're just speculating, but what do you think about that? That, hey, I'm putting out my digital dollar. I don't want any of these stablecoins in the market.
So I think, what is the best way to say this? People use the term CBDC to mean many things. I think we need to pause and ask, what do people actually mean? And if you think it's going to replace stable coins, I would like to ask some very specific questions about how your CBDC is designed. Because as we think about stable coins, right now, they are, while not permissionless, pseudonymous, on public blockchains, interoperable across jurisdictions. And every single CBDC project is non-interoperable because it is issued on a chain or a platform, because many of them don't even need to use blockchains, that a central bank unilaterally controls. This has a lot of implications for how market structure can work, right? Because if I am a merchant in Thailand and I want to receive a US CBDC to pay for inventory or something like that, how? Like, do I have to go open a US bank account? That's actually quite difficult. Can I face the Federal Reserve directly? On what platform am I going to be doing this? How do I get it back into my local economy? One of the things you see with almost all the CBDC projects is they kind of make the mistake that, physicists and mathematicians make all the time of assume all cows are spherical and frictionless to compute a problem. And it's like, well, yes, but you've also assumed away the hard part. Right. And what all the CBDCs assume away is governance, right? It cannot be the case that we have 50 CBDCs that are interoperable on the same platform, but all of the central banks have unilateral control of that platform, which is what they want. That's not a thing, right? It doesn't work that way. Right. And so my personal view is, as you look at these systems, CBDCs are likely to be adopted to some degree, varying degrees, in local markets for payments usage. Maybe for settlement, but that requires a platform where the CBDC can be exchanged real time against tokenized assets in some form. And there are ways to do that, but you have to think down that path. It gets a lot harder to use them internationally or cross-jurisdictionally unless somebody's willing to give up control of their own money.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And you gave a great perspective on, they're not really going to be interoperable and they're going to be centralized. So yeah, as far as usage is going to be very difficult, but like a Circle's USDC, which is interoperable, it's on different chains. That's a great way or a great stablecoin that could be used across the world.
Now, on that point, you could totally see USDC being backed with a US dollar CBDC at some point in the future, if that's a thing that happens. But that is different than the CBDC itself being on public blockchains and used globally.
Interesting. I didn't think about that. The public stable coins being backed by the CBDC. That's interesting.
Exactly. Because if you hold your reserves in the CBDC, by definition, you're not going to have default or run risk there. And so again, I think we're very early in the game. Remember, blockchains are really only about 14 years old, right? If we say the start is 2009 for Bitcoin. And keeping in mind the internet, depending on how you want to peg it, was created in like the late 70s, early 80s. Right. We're at about 1994 when everybody still got those CDs for AOL that we're all using as coasters. And my mother can't make anything work and can barely use email. And, so we're very early innings here. How the world of stablecoin, CBDCs, and blockchain will look 30 years forward will be dramatically different than today.
Great point. Now, you spent some time at Paxos, and Paxos, of course, is the one facilitating PayPal's development of their stablecoin. They also help facilitate BUSD, and we saw that got shut down. What are your thoughts on that? And could any other stablecoins be at risk of shutdown? I know Binance has this bigger problem, right? That's happening. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would say, look, without saying too much, because given my past employment history here, the concerns around BUSD, I would say, were largely Binance specific. And I think largely had to do with confusion and poor controls around BUSD issued on the Ethereum chain, which was the NYDFS regulated token, and then wrapped BUSD issued on a whole bunch of other chains, right? Was there some massive problem with like coins outstanding that couldn't be redeemed or fake money? No. And you can see that definitionally because it was taken from about 22.5 billion down to like 3 billion with no peg stability problems or issues of that sort. Right. By the way, proof that you can create regulatory regimes that can handle these things properly. So good job to the DFS on that part. But I would say, I think the concerns there were very much around transparency, representation, and understanding. So I don't see PayPal as having any of those issues. I don't see USDP. I don't see GUSD. I don't see the GMO products, right? That I think was pretty granular and specific to something that Binance was doing.
What do you think about the recent SEC subpoena of PayPal documents? Now, it's just a subpoena. They could just be looking at the information. There's no lawsuit or anything. What does your gut tell you? Is something around the corner here?
I mean, my honest view on that is this is just an extension of the SEC's incredibly negative conduct in this space. And the reason I call it incredibly negative is not like pro or anti-regulation. I'm on the record being pretty pro-regulation in other spaces. I've said positive things about the DFS, the New York Fed, the CFTC, the JFSA, the BMA, like the list goes on. The SEC in particular is doing two things that I find pretty odious. One is trying to constantly expand their remit without telling people what the rules are. Right. So, contrast this to, say, the OCC, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC. I disagree with them on some aspects on policy, but they're willing to clearly and publicly state what they think the rules are and what people are allowed to do. They put a note in the Federal Register laying out their views on blockchains pretty clearly for their banks.
Right.
So even if you disagree, they'll tell you exactly what the stance is. And if you come in and talk to them, we'll tell you, well, yeah, you can do X, Y, Z, and no, you can't do A, B, C, and here's why. So that, I think, is, even if you disagree, it's fair. Yep. On the other hand, the SEC just won't tell you what's allowed or not and then sues people after the fact. Number two, they have a near perfect track record of failing to interdict bad actors, but preemptively going after good actors. And that's just infuriating, right? Like beforehand, they should have been trying to do something about FTX US, Celsius, BlockFi, Three Arrows Capital, Genesis, and DCG. Like, it's a target-rich environment out there in crypto, let's put it that way. Who have they actually managed to sue for the most part? It's like Ripple and Coinbase and like sending a Wells notice to Paxos and Stoner Cats, which like doesn't matter. Right. So it's just a complete failure of regulation in terms of investor protection and capital formation being their goals, while they've catastrophically failed at both. And then on top of that, I would say this is just a continuation. Like, there are so many things that could potentially be problems in the stablecoin space, like what's going on with TUSD, everybody's ongoing concerns with Tether. And even if I think those are overblown, fine, go target that, right? Some of the KYC AML issues with everything on Tron. They're, again, very target-rich environment. So who do you go after? You go after PayPal, who's regulated by the global regulator with the most experience in stablecoins, with the least problems and the best track record. It's hard to read that as anything other than both intimidation and a grab for power.
Yeah, and Austin, I know this is a hard question I'm going to ask you here, but what do you think is the root cause of this? Is it a political thing? Is it TradFi incumbents pulling the puppet strings, slow these crypto startups down? I still think about that. I'm trying to grasp what is the genesis of this, because why would you as an agency do this unless somebody else is influencing you?
Well, so I would say I think there's a couple of things going on there. One thing to remember is that most U.S. regulators are, quite frankly, underpaid and overworked. And depending on the granularity of the policies at various regulators, that can have a real impact on talent and retention. So I don't know how many people are aware of this, but the highest paid person at the SEC makes about what your average associate in investment banking makes. And at the same time, you are banned from owning crypto if you work on crypto at the SEC. So the odds of them getting talented or capable people at the SEC to work on this stuff is a rounding error on zero. People just won't do it, especially now with their track record. Two, I think there's a little bit of a sort of, let's call it a path dependency problem for the SEC specifically, where they've been so skeptical for so long and so non-constructive that now reversing course on that would be such massive egg on their face. I think they've kind of trapped themselves. Third, I don't think the animus is like, oh, we're going to protect TradFi, or, oh, we have this like nefarious side agenda to push some other thing. I think it's just that the chair is not particularly informed and is very aggressive and doesn't understand what he's doing from a legal perspective. And so, he thought he'd go out, crack down on the space and somehow it would all magically fall in line. It's important for people to remember Gensler's not a lawyer, right? So you have somebody who doesn't understand the intimate details inside of these cases, trying to guide the strategy for the entirety of the SEC. And it's, been about as much of a disaster as you would expect.
So rightly so, a disaster. I mean, grayscale. And it was unbelievable, the language used by those judges in the appeal case, arbitrary and capricious. And not to mention in the Ripple case, you had the judges calling out the SEC saying they lack faithful allegiance to the law. And I'm just like, wow. This is supposed to be a government agency. It's supposed to have integrity. It's supposed to protect investors. And they're getting called out for not abiding by the law.
This is also not unique to crypto, which is another thing people need to understand. The SEC for a long time has operated as though they had unilateral power. So they're currently getting raked over the coals for these internal administrative courts, where you essentially have a prosecutor from the SEC who picks a judge from the SEC who hears your case. Right. Transparently not fair. No real concept of due process in that. And they're getting wrecked as this moves through the court system. Mm-hmm. So these problems extend significantly beyond crypto, with the updates to the qualified custodian rule. Before we even talk about how broken it is for digital assets, it's completely broken for alternative asset markets in general, commodities, art, all those kinds of things. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier. The SEC, I think, has a talent problem and an incentives problem, and probably needs a ground-up rework as an agency at this point.
So on that note, what do you think about Congressman Warren Davidson's restructuring the SEC bill? Do you think that model could work?
So, by the way, shout out to Warren. I spoke with him a bit when I was testifying. I'll tell people here, I'm transparently, I'll say I'm a Democrat in New York. Warren's a Republican, but there's a lot of common ground in things we think are good for the financial system here. I would say if we're going to talk about reforming the SEC, the most important thing to understand is that the core mission of the SEC is just, right? Investor protection, keeping frauds out of the space, and forming an environment where businesses that are legitimate will prosper and businesses that are illegitimate will die is what we need in American markets. So I don't have a problem with the concept of the SEC. I also don't have a problem with lawsuits against people who are a problem. I think if you really want to reform the SEC, you need to radically change the governance. You probably need to get rid of most of the current staff. You need to significantly up pay so that we can get real experts in there. And then you also probably need to change where they're geographically based, because having a super majority of that agency be New York lawyers is not good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And do you feel, hard question, what's a timeline to do something like that? I don't know if you know the answer to that, but, is that like a 10-year thing where, we have to kind of dig those roots out and use something like Warren Davidson's bill, and also Congress needs to pass regulations, and it's a combination of those things?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's 10 years. The reality is you could probably wind the current one down in a year or two and create the new one. The question is, do we have a combination of the political will and the understanding of the problem? Because probably nobody has been more damaged by the current SEC than small retail investors. So it's shocking to me that so many Democrats are on the wrong side of this issue. The fact that Elizabeth Warren is waging a crusade against the technology most likely to disrupt the too big to fail banks is the kind of inversion that one never would have expected in the past, right? It's like Barack Obama opposing healthcare or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so strange. I don't know if she's doing this to raise campaign funds or what. I don't know what's happening, but it's so strange that she's doing this and has an anti.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of as a warning to all my Democratic friends out there, I know a lot of former Warren supporters and some staffers who are voting Republican over this issue.
Wow. What do you think about the Coinbase SEC lawsuit that's happening? Obviously, they're suing each other. Do you think Coinbase comes out of this with a victory?
With anything in law, it's going to be a partial decision that both sides are unhappy with, if we're going to follow the trend here. And one thing that I've been saying to people in this space is you need to be very careful about litigating these things. And that also applies to the SEC, because judges are going to tell you what they think the law is.
Yeah.
And in the current case, that may be very disruptive to the understanding of a number of things. We could see anything come out of the Coinbase case. And so far, it has not looked good for the SEC, to be clear. But as we work through the court system, you're looking at anything from, actually, as it turns out, yes, Starbucks gift cards are securities, and basically every major American company is committing massive securities fraud, all the way to the current Supreme Court being a bit originalist, being like, we don't see anything about the internet and the 40 Act, so we don't know why you think you can regulate any of this, right? So beware of disruption in something this complicated. To me, the Coinbase lawsuit is the single best point as to why we need Congress to act. Because if it's so unclear that the largest, cleanest exchange in the space can't comply with the rules and nobody even knows what the rules are, like, how much more obvious is it that you need regulation? And by the way, if we don't pass it, it's all just going to move offshore.
Yeah. So are you optimistic that, maybe these bills in the House can make it out by early 2024, possibly the one in the Senate, the Lummis-Gillibrand bill? Which one are you more in favor of? And are you optimistic, they can be signed into law anytime soon?
So I'm pretty skeptical about this Congress getting anything done, just thanks to the political dynamics. But if there's a bill that's going to pass, I think it's probably the stablecoin bill. And I think that for two reasons. One, it's a priority for McHenry and the financial services folks, and it's something they would be willing to trade in a budget deal, is my guess. And there are some things Senate banking wants. So, things get done in Washington when there's a deal to be made. Two, I think the banking regulators are increasingly waking up to the fact that they cracked down on stablecoins, and instead of going away, Tether got bigger. Right? If we understand anything about Eurodollar markets and US dollar dominance and controlling like financial crime and KYC AML, the sources of those information, we should understand the last thing you want is stablecoins all moving offshore. That is a terrible outcome for the United States, just from an economic and security perspective. And I think some of the banking regulators are starting to figure out, oh no, we may have screwed up here and we need to get these back as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, and just for the simple fact too, that the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. And obviously the Federal Reserve and the whole system has had a really good hold of it and control of it. But now with stable coins, they could lose control very easily. So there's a lot of risk here.
I want to go the other way and say if they do it properly, it actually cements their control, right? Because if you have US dollar stablecoins circulating on public blockchains, able to be used globally, redeemable only with US entities that are doing KYC and AML, where we have all the original data and can use blockchain analytics, what is going to happen? You are going to have people in many economies that are much more mismanaged than the United States flocking to the dollar. It increases dollar dominance and usage. It increases the pool of funding for the Treasury, and it increases our ability to enforce sanctions.
Yeah, because I've been hearing stories out of Latin America of folks using USDC, obviously a lot of them dealing with hyperinflation. So having a standardized stable coin, if you want to call it that, would be incredible for the world reserve currency of the US dollar to maintain that status.
And that is exactly it, right? Like, if you're in Argentina and your choices are the Argentine peso or Tether, you're going to use Tether.
Yeah.
But if your choice were the Argentine peso or maybe something like PayPal's US dollar or Tether, you might prefer PayPal's US dollar. Now imagine we can create a properly reserved interest-bearing version of that, right? Again, you can see how this would project dollar dominance throughout the world and sort of serve as a check on the worst behavior of central banks elsewhere. Because as much as people hate on the dollar, and look, there are plenty of reasons to hate on the dollar, There are a lot of other things you could hate on way more. It may be the situation that the dollar is a little bit like Churchill on democracy, which is the worst option except for all the others, right? But, it is a tool to get it to people who otherwise have a hard time getting their hands on it.
What are your thoughts on this? I know I'm branching off a little bit here, but, there's a lot of talks that UBI is going to be needed because tech is eating up jobs, AI, and so forth. It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight, but eventually people are not going to be able to earn a living. There's just not going to be the jobs. And there's talks of universal basic income. I know the folks at WorldCoin are trying to do something like this. But to your point, if we have this regulated stablecoin and that is on multiple chains and it's globally distributed, that could be an avenue that the U.S. government uses to provide UBI. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think the UBI discussion really should be separated, right? Because one is what are the rails and the other one is what do we want to pay people for, right? And paying people effectively presupposes good rails, but there's a lot of pro stablecoin arguments that are not pro UBI and a lot of pro UBI arguments that are not pro stablecoin. So one of the things I'm big on in this space, especially with regard to stablecoins, is trying to stay laser focused on what are we doing here. So my comment on that would be, sure, you could use them for UBI. There's a lot of other things you could use for UBI, but the reason to promote use stablecoins really has to do with eliminating intermediaries, transparency, reducing the dominance of the GSIB banks, right, and trying to get to a safer system that's less run prone. There are many financial markets upgrades here, and I would put that probably 100 or lower on my list of items.
Sure. Now, Austin, despite everything we've talked about, the challenges, the SEC and so forth, I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was something in the air, but BlackRock all of a sudden said, we want a Bitcoin spot ETF. That line grew around the block. Franklin Templeton, some of the biggest names on Wall Street came in. You saw crypto exchanges being launched by Fidelity and Charles Schwab and these folks, and much more. MasterCard, Visa, all these guys doing their thing. Are we at that institutional tipping point? Are the cards on the table and now they're all here ready to take part?
So one thing I'll say is it really depends on what you mean by tipping point. As a general rule of thumb for financial markets transformation, it will take a lot longer than people think, but the impact will be much larger than people think. So I would tell you we're probably at a tipping point for people wanting to offer spot ETFs. That seems pretty obvious. And I think Grayscale's fight with the SEC is a lot of the driver for that, where the writing on the wall is becoming obvious. Do I think they're ready to jump into crypto wholesale? No. And more to the point, I'm not sure they ever will. It may be the case that a little bit like the early internet, a lot of what's been built is really cool experiments, but most of it's not going to last, right? And that the blockchain we're going to be using 20 years from now to exchange like value, or many blockchains most likely, have not even yet been created, right? And so one view I hold, is I think people will launch spot ETFs. They'll continue to experiment in the space. The things I'm sure of are tokenized assets are going to be a thing, and they will be traded because there's huge value to the technology when you really understand the details. And that two, I think a lot of the long-term value will be captured by real-world companies building into the blockchain and crypto space rather than crypto and blockchain companies building out to the real world. Because quite frankly, having done both, in a lot of cases, the real-world part's a lot harder, right? Like take AAA video games. It's a hell of a lot harder to build a AAA video game studio than it is to just launch a blockchain, right? So do we think, let's take two examples here. Do we think Rockstar is more likely to launch a blockchain, or the Solana people are more likely to be able to make Red Dead Redemption 2? Right. I know which way I'm betting on that. Now, opinions may vary, and that's fine. Like, I know Mike Dudas, he might get on here and argue with me about that. But my view is I think it will more be the technological adoption that really drives it. So what I would watch for is not the ETFs. It's more things like Visa and PayPal. When are companies actually starting to try to use this in their core operations?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And I've talked a bit about that these large brands and companies who have the money, the resources, can go and build their own versions. And, we're maybe in the first iteration, and the second iteration is going to look much different. And maybe they acquire some of these existing blockchains, right, and integrate them in. And we've seen that in Web 1.0, Web 2.0. So it's to be seen. Now, tough question for you. Do you feel we're going to get a Bitcoin spot ETF approval within the next 6 months or so? Everybody's clamoring for one. Everybody's throwing out their predictions. What are your thoughts?
My prediction on that is yes, but specifically around the fact that I don't think they can delay Grayscale's conversion for that long based on the court timeframe there. I think if the SEC continues to delay, they start to get themselves potentially out of the, hey, you were doing things wrong, but here's a second chance judicial framework, into the, you were doing things wrong and we told you, so now you guys have personal liability for your actions type framework. Because keep in mind, most of the time in an agency, right, if you're undertaking actions, even if you're wrong, you have no personal liability. You're shielded from that. You have the ability to do your job and exercise discretion. If a court has instead told you that you need to do X, Y, Z, and we expect to see it on this time frame, and you start flagrantly violating those kinds of things, they do not like that, and they will do some very ugly things to you. Like, as a general statement, don't mess around with federal judges. Like, they don't play. And so I think really the driver of the spot ETFs is going to be Grayscale's court case, because once that genie's out of the bottle, they got to let everybody go.
Do you think they approve multiple ETFs at once to kind of, avoid criticism and calls of unfairness? Because I've been saying for a long time, if BlackRock skips the line and they get approved first, is a clear bias.
I would say if I were advising the SEC, which I'm not on this one, the smartest thing they could do would be to approve all of these simultaneously. Right. You don't want to give any appearance of favoritism to anybody. You don't want to look like you're putting your finger on the scale one way or another. And given how weird the filing timeline is now with all of the refilings of previous rejections, there's like first come, first serve. It's hard to determine what that even means at this point. Is that like the first filing way back in the day?
Right.
Or is that the first filing on the current schedule? Like, they're probably best off doing it all simultaneously.
I wanted to follow up on the SAB 121 custodian item, because the GAO said, this did not pass the sniff test. Do you think the SEC is going to get some lawsuits over this?
Lawsuits, potentially, yes. They should also just retract it, because it's a gross misunderstanding of how custody works, and it's been a huge problem. Like I've said on the record, if not for SAB 121, I think there's a real chance that FTX might not have happened, right? And the reason for that is we in crypto, for all of our talking about decentralization, have gone and created one of the single most centralized entities in the history of finance, which is the crypto exchange, all right? Because that thing works as an exchange. So in traditional terms, think of like the New York Stock Exchange. It also operates as your custodian. So in traditional terms, think of Boney Mellon. And it operates as your clearing agent. So in traditional terms, think of DTCC, right? So we've taken three different things that exist with segregated duties in traditional markets and compacted them into basically a black hole that sucks everything into it in crypto. So again, if anybody wonders why I say crypto has some things to learn from finance, right there, separating your exchange from custody is good housekeeping. Top of the list, would have solved so many problems. All right. So SAB 121 in the United States basically makes it completely uneconomically feasible for custodians in the US to serve crypto, because what it says is, even though these are customer assets and they belong to the customers, you need to put them on your own balance sheet and hold risk capital against them as though you own them and are taking the risk on them. This is completely insane.
Yeah.
If we did that with traditional financial assets, there would be no custodians, and it is a complete break from proper practice about how these things work. It also raises a lot of questions about things like ownership and control and bankruptcy remoteness that could totally torpedo investors in a bankruptcy proceeding. So again, this is the SEC just trying to impede things largely at the expense of retail investors and damaging them in their quest to, oppose technological progress. So SAB 121, to me, transparently was incorrect, right? It's incorrect both in the way in which they issued it, which is what they got called out for, because you can't just write a letter saying, hey, we're kind of thinking about this, and then enforce it as law. And then two, just the substance of what they're trying to do there is quite frankly, crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. And man, I don't know who at the SEC is coming up with this stuff. But the other thing that people were calling out is that Gary Gensler and the and the SEC staff were meeting with FTX officials, including Sam Bankman-Fried, and all this fraud was happening. And, one can ask, why were they not looking into the business and what was happening in the Bahamas and so forth? Any thoughts on the trial wrap up? And I know there's sentencing that's scheduled for next year.
I mean, as a general statement, I think fraudsters and scammers getting their just desserts is a good thing for the world. Right. There's nothing about crypto that's a magical shield from the law or liability. Like, if I can't run a scam in the normal world, I shouldn't be able to run it on a blockchain either.
Right. And
taking people's money, stealing a part of it to buy yourself mansions and give it away to politicians, and taking the rest and YOLOing it into degen stuff. And here's the important part, lying about doing all of that is transparently fraud. Like, in a strange way, this is going to sound a little bit bizarre, but had SBF just been unflinchingly honest about every single thing he was doing, it might have been legal. Problem is, he would have had way, 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 way less customers, which is why he was dishonest. But the core problem is saying things like, we have all the customer funds, they are safe, they are secure, and then at the same time doing all of these things. And I think, by the way, the prosecution did a very good job laying that out, because when a jury comes back that quickly, it was an easy decision for them. This did not take days. Quite frankly, the biggest delay was probably them eating dinner, right? And so this case was over very quickly when it went to deliberations. That's not a good sign for the defendant.
Oh, yeah. Know we're running up on time, so I got some wrap-up questions here for you. If you could create your own metaverse, what would the theme be?
Boy, I mean, I'm almost going to dodge that question, because any good answer that I give you is far too nerdy and boring for the people on a podcast, because we don't need a metaverse about like financial plumbing and real-time settlement and like the nuances of fixed income. So I'm just going to punt on that by saying I'm a genuinely dire person to ask that question of.
I got some rapid fire questions for you. Favorite food?
Oh, favorite food. Okay, so you're killing me here. My wife is Indian, and she makes amazing South Indian food. So does her mother, by the way. So shout out to Usha on this one too. So I'm going to go with Indian food as like the home field answer there, but there are 6 or 7 other types of food I could answer, and I'd be good with that, man.
Nice. Favorite musician or band?
Tool. Easy answer for me. Been a fan for a long time. Yeah,
I'm a fan of Tool as well. Favorite movie?
Okay, you're killing me here with these. To lean into the crypto dystopia cyberpunk vibe, I'm going to go with Blade Runner, but as a close second, Seven Samurai.
Well, I'm a big Blade Runner fan. Huge. I love it. Favorite book?
All right, so that one is probably much easier. Neuromancer, William Gibson.
Nice. And when you're not doing anything blockchain or crypto related, what are you doing for fun as a hobby?
Oh boy. So I have been a long time strategy gamer, and I don't mean that in terms of video games. I mean that in terms of tabletop gaming, because I think there's something that you gain by doing it face to face with your friends.
For sure. Austin, pleasure chatting with you. And I'll definitely have to have you back on as things progress in the crypto market. Appreciate your insights.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed this. Great conversation. Thank you.